I'd like to begin by wishing you all peace and addressing you as my brothers and sisters, my relatives. I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the land of the Haudenosaunee. Although I began in Ojibwe, I'd like to acknowledge that we are here in Haudenosaunee land. I am very grateful for their continued stewardship, for their wisdom and compassion in still overseeing these lands. I ask that we would all pray and work for justice, truth, and peace.
Thank you, Bishop Mark. The Dealing with Our Darknesses series of community conversations is presented by 3 centers housed at Renison University College. Dr. Wendy Fletcher, the principal of Renison University College, is here to bring her greetings. And then, much to her disappointment, Dr. Fletcher needs to leave for another event on campus at one of our sister colleges. Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Marilyn. Good evening, everyone. It is a privilege to be here tonight and to add my voice to Marilyn's, a voice of welcome and a voice of hope, a voice of commendation. I commend you all. I commend those who imagined this series that tonight begins. I commend our leaders who have the courage to come and begin us on this journey of exploration. And I commend all of you. I commend all of us here this evening for our courage to open up the pages of our respective faith story and seek not only the bright pages, the happy pages, the easy pages, but those pages that are complicated and fraught not only with peril but sometimes with horror. Takes courage. It also takes imagination, because one would never do that. One would never step into these waters if one did not have also eyes with that courage that have an imagination, that getting stuck in those pages is not why we open them, but we open them so that we can see them, and in seeing them, become a new thing together. Peoples with integrity, buoyed up by courage, led on by vision, and committed always to living as well as we can to be people of truth-telling and not people of the lie. I'm a historian by training, and history of Christianity is what I've taught over these last almost 3 decades, and many times over the course of that 3 decades, I have had people say to me this same question, and it's come in the most surprising places, sometimes in the classroom, sometimes elsewhere. The question is this: how can you possibly teach the history of Christianity and still be a Christian? That's a hard question and a hard indictment of a very complicated 2,000-year story. But the answer I give is the answer that really lives in me, which is that when you are a person of faith, faith means journeying into the whole story, not part of the story. To be a Christian or a Muslim, I would venture to say, or a person of any kind of faith in this generation confronted with our humanity, which is always so broken, we know that to be people of any faith or any hope at all is to be a people that stand there between the broken and the beautiful. And it is in awareness of the broken and in hope for the beautiful that we gather tonight. So I thank you all for being here. I commend you for your courage. And I do entirely trust that the beautiful we long for in the midst of the broken, by the act of our commitment and integrity, will be possible between us and for us in each of our traditions. Thank you.
support of the Anglican Foundation of Canada. We are also grateful for the support of our community partners, Waterloo Lutheran Seminary, Interfaith Grand River, Noor Cultural Center, and the Muslim Studies option at Wilfrid Laurier University. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from two well-respected speakers, whom I shall introduce shortly. But first, I wanted to give you an overview of the format for the evening. Following the talks, two of the organizers, Dr. Darrell Bryant and Dr. Timothy Gianotti, will respond to the speakers. A fourth organizer, Dr. Idrissa Pandit, is ill and unable to join us tonight, and we do wish her a speedy recovery. Following Dr. Bryan and Dr. Gianotti's responses, there will be an opportunity for you to pose questions to our speakers. When you came in tonight, you should have received 2 file cards. We're asking that you please write your questions on the file cards, and at the end of the lecture, before the responses, we will collect them. Now to tonight's speakers. I will introduce both our speakers, and then Bishop McDonald will begin. The Right Reverend Mark Macdonald became the Anglican Church of Canada's first national Indigenous Anglican bishop in 2007, after serving as Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Alaska in the United States for 10 years. Becoming the national Indigenous bishop was a homecoming of sorts for Bishop MacDonald, who attended Whitford College in Toronto and served as a priest in Mississauga, prior to his postgraduate studies at Luther Northwestern Theological Seminary in Minneapolis. Bishop Mark has had a long and varied ministry, holding positions in Canada and the United States, including the Southeast Regional Mission of the Diocese of Navajo Land. I have had the privilege to witness Bishop MacDonald serving faithfully, reading and celebrating, guiding, teaching, and challenging both Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in the church and in civic society. Among Bishop MacDonald's challenges to the church is the alignment of the Western Church with, quote, the worst aspects of the colonial occupation of Turtle Island. It was, we could say, hypnotized by the military and economic power of its cultural context, end quote. Bishop MacDonald also challenges the church over its second phase of colonization, in which, quote, the church's silence has contributed to the widespread notion that there is very little that the Christian faith has to say about the environmental crisis, very little about climate injustice, end quote. We are privileged this evening to be able to listen to Bishop MacDonald's prophetic voice, addressing repentance, grace, and the possibility of transformation. Unfortunately, though, I don't think we'll get to hear his accomplished guitar playing. I didn't see him bringing the guitar case in, or his singing, but we'll see how the evening unfolds. Please welcome Bishop MacDonald and his wife Virginia, who is also here with us tonight. Our second speaker this evening will be Dr. Ingrid Vassman. Dr. Vassman is a Muslim religious leader and a professor of Islamic studies, an interfaith activist, and one of the most trusted religious voices in the North American Muslim community. She currently serves as the London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies at Huron University College at the University of Western Ontario in London. Dr. Vassman's writings, both academic and public, focus primarily on Quranic interpretation, Islamic theological ethics, and interfaith relations. Her book, The Story of the Quran, is an academic bestseller and was chosen by the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities for inclusion in its Bridging Cultures program. In 2001 to 2010, Dr. Vassman served as Vice President, then as President, of of the Islamic Society of North America, the first woman to serve in either position. She also served as the principal architect and director of North America's very first Muslim chaplaincy graduate program at Hartford Seminary, where she taught before coming back to Canada. Among her many awards, Dr. Vassman was named Newsweek magazine's People to Watch in 2007, and Jordan's Royal Institute for Strategic Studies 500 Most Influential Muslims in 2009, 10, 11, and 12. At Renison, we are privileged to have Dr. Vassman present more than once. Dr. Vassman was here at one of our interfaith dialogues a few years ago, and so we are now doubly privileged by her presence tonight. Please welcome Dr. Ingrid Vassman.
Thank you. It's good. It's an honor to be here. It's also challenging, the topic, and I hope I will do it justice. And I hope I will do justice to that very wonderful introduction, especially the part about the guitar. It's difficult to see everybody, and as a preacher, I'm usually used to watching everybody in the congregation. I'll do my best, however. I wear the black. Mekadewik onayed. It's an Algonquian word that is used to describe people in ministry, in Christian ministry. They wear the black. And that is a difficult thing to do, to wear the black. When I meet people, and if I'm not wearing the black, they'll ask me what I do, and they often say, "Good luck." My daughters tell me that when people ask what their dad does, they tell them, and then they go, "Oh, oh, oh." I think the thing that most people understand and know is that there is a difficult relationship, a troubled relationship between the church and indigenous peoples, especially here on Turtle Island, as was mentioned before. The heart of this, of course, is what happened with the residential schools, 82 residential schools that were operated by the churches on behalf of the government. And in these 82 schools, at the height, that was how many there were, over 180,000 students were processed through. A period of time in Canada that has been called by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a time of cultural genocide. Now, the church's complicity and involvement in that has been very, very difficult, and difficult for the church to respect, difficult for the church to acknowledge, and difficult for the church to process. Like any institution, in any Western institution, they did what they could. And on that level, you could say that what they did was even sacrificial. They made an apology, and then they changed their policies. But for a religion that claims to be ambassadors of reconciliation, to simply say we made a mistake doesn't really cut it. For in fact, the church became an ambassador of colonization, and it worked for the government, for the culture, in a religious, social, psychological, cultural, economic arrangement. It seems to me that the church has a lot to learn about what happened. It knows the facts, but I think it has to understand more deeply what happened. And I think that is important not just in terms of the relationship with indigenous peoples, but with the church's relationship to the larger culture and the church's relationship to the rest of the world. I think that what has been difficult for the church has been to go beyond the explanations based on the widespread understanding of life from the perspective of individual autonomy. This culture looks at things in that way. The individual autonomy is so strong in the way people think about things that when something goes wrong, you look for the perpetrators. We look for the perp walk. We try to find and identify those people who have done the wrong thing. The problem with the residential schools is that we are dealing with systemic evil. And what the church has to understand is that we're not dealing with something that involves individual autonomy. We are talking about something that is religious, something that is social, something that is cultural, something that is economic. In this instance, we see that a system of evil so swamped individual autonomy that we find people acting against their most deeply held commitments. Jesus himself warned of the way in which evil can overcome religious institutions. He spent an awful lot of time focusing in his teaching on the dangers of religious corruption. The problem has been that instead of seeing that and applying that kind of self-critique, we've used those scriptures to describe other people and pointed towards other people and said, they're the Pharisees. They're the Pharisees. What Jesus asks us to understand, and I think what we have just gone through in terms of this participation in systemic evil, he asks us to understand our capacity religiously as an institution of religion for corruption and to act accordingly. Now, St. Francis, who in anybody's book is an excellent example of what Christian faith is, spoke to his followers of the need for reparations. What he meant was that before Christians could engage people in conversation, they had to do reparations for what they had done in the past. He identified this specifically and particularly in regard to Islam. And although I'm not qualified to judge the results of that, I would say that the insight is important and critical. We, as Christian people, need to make reparations before we can begin to speak, before we can begin to approach reconciliation, before we can begin to speak and talk about what it is that we believe. We have some very serious work for us. We have some very serious work to continue, I think, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Now, looking at reconciliation in regard to indigenous peoples, which I think, again, is an important thing as a preparation for this conversation. Robert Schreiter is a Roman Catholic missiologist, and he said, after studying Truth and Reconciliation Commissions all over the world, he said that he could not find a single instance when reconciliation happened because an oppressor decided to be nice. In fact, he said reconciliation always happens when an oppressed people claim their humanity. And it's so important that we understand that that's what has happened in Canada through the Truth and Reconciliation process and where we are standing today. If we are to enter into reconciliation, it must be Canada's acknowledgement of what has happened, and for Christians, I think, a deeper understanding of the systemic evil that it is participated in. Now, I want to close, and when I say I close, that usually means I'm halfway done, but I'm a little bit closer than halfway. I want to close by offering what I would call an indigenous epistemology, a way of knowing, a way of looking, and as an antidote for the way that Christians have acted in the past. And I'm speaking of four-directional thinking, where most of us are familiar. I saw Daryl had a medicine wheel on his vest. We're familiar with the yellow, red, black, and white of the medicine wheel. This represents an awful lot of different things, but tonight I would like to speak about four-directional thinking. And the specific example that I'm taking, I received from Navajo elders. Imagine, if you will, in your spiritual mind, that truth is a mountain, a great big mountain. That mountain is clear, it is present, it is something that is tangible in a truly awesome way. Four-directional thinking says that in order to understand the mountain, in order to speak about it in a comprehensive way, you have to look at it from a minimum of four different directions. This is an acknowledgement that our knowledge, even that knowledge which approaches comprehension, is always fragmented, always needs to walk around truth, to look at it from its various angles. This is a way of saying that truth is truly and completely present, but that the human perception of it is always limited and weak. When Navajo elders speak, when they articulate some spiritual truth, they always say "Jine" after that. "Jine" means that's what they say. Now, when the missionaries told them about Jesus, and they said Jesus was raised from the dead, and the elders said Jesus was raised from the dead, "Jine," that's what they say. The missionaries didn't like it at all. They didn't like it at all. And they said, "Don't say it that way. Don't say it that way." But you have to understand that that "Jine" is the marker of spiritual truth. It's the marker of spiritual truth saying that no one human being, no collective of human beings can claim to know spiritual truth in a completely comprehensive way. I think that Christian faith, on its road to reparation, on its road towards reconciliation, has to recover a kind of humility about what it believes and its capacity for belief. And I hope that this conversation over the next while will help do that. Thank you very much.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace to everyone here. I was at Renison a few years ago, but this is the first time I've been back to the main University of Waterloo campus in almost 30 years. And we say that those who do not thank people have not thanked God. So I want to take this opportunity to be so grateful to all of those who educated me here in the departments of philosophy and fine arts and other places before I went on with my other studies. We're so fortunate to have access to such wonderful education, libraries, knowledge, of course, security and peace for most of us. So we should feel pretty comfortable and we should feel safe enough to be able to do some self-examination, I think. But it's hard, it's always hard. And I think it's harder at the individual level or at the communal level even than it is at the individual level. Did you ever listen to Speaking of Faith with Krista Tippett? If you're in Minnesota, yes, a wonderful program, radio program. The name of the show was changed a few years ago to On Being, but she has wonderful conversations about faith and spirituality. Krista Tippett interviewed me about a year, in the year following 9/11. And in an extended conversation, she asked me what I was most concerned about in terms of the ramifications and the effects of 9/11. And I think a lot of people in my community were, justifiably concerned about hate crimes, discriminatory legislation. I was living in the United States at that time. What we've come to term Islamophobia. But what I told Krista is that I was most concerned about how the inevitable experience of discrimination would change our own view of ourselves and would distort our view of ourselves and distort our priorities and make us think of ourselves primarily as victims of oppression, rather than people who, like all people, can engage in both good and evil. Externalizing evil, externalizing darkness is the biggest threat to a sound spiritual state. And I think that has happened in many cases. I think that a community, the most destructive and oppressive effect of being marginalized, of being unjustly criticized. There are just criticisms, but unjust criticisms, of being constantly placed in a position of having to defend oneself, makes one focus on externalities and turn the inner, the inner voice, become deaf to the inner voice and turn our gaze away from who we are inside. There's a beautiful story that was told by the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, about a man who at the end of his life gathered his children around him and said, "Children, I really have not been a very good person in my life. In fact, I've been quite horrible, and I've done an awful lot of terrible things. I really am afraid of what God is going to do with me. So when I die, I want you to burn my body, and I want you to take the ashes and separate them and take them to the farthest corners of the earth that you can find, so that I will be disappeared." So his children follow his instructions, and they burn his body, and they scatter his ashes across the earth. And of course, the Lord of the universe then commands that all of these small, tiny pieces will be gathered up and brought back together, and the man is re-embodied. And when he's re-embodied, the Lord of the universe asks him, "Why did you do that? Why did you tell your children to burn your body and scatter your ashes?" And he said, "Because I feared your judgment, and I know that I've done wrong, and I feared what you would do with me." And the Lord of the universe then says to him, "Your fear is your recognition of my right for judgment and of my command over the universe, and for that you are forgiven." Now, when we do wrong, it's not just history, it's not just memory. We are souls who are embodied in this life, and we feel it. We feel that burden. We feel the burden of what we've done. And when we feel burdened, there are different ways of dealing with that. Sometimes we try to anesthetize the pain. We try to distract ourselves from that feeling of being burdened. Very often, we project that darkness that we feel onto others, and so engage in violence. We learn from our tradition, the Islamic tradition, that all people, every human being, is born in a state of purity. We do not believe that that darkness is the fundamental or foundational state of human beings, and that there's always an opportunity for repentance. It is, in fact, our first father and mother, Adam and Eve, who taught us how to repent. The Quranic story of Adam and Eve is similar in some ways to the biblical story, but is very different in other ways. For Adam and Eve both together disobey God. They realize that by disobeying God that they have sinned, and then together they seek forgiveness from their Lord. And that forgiveness is granted. So repentance is always possible, even from a primordial, from a foundational sin for humanity. We all have that opportunity to turn to God in repentance. So we're born in a pure state, but we have the opportunity when we sin to seek repentance. But there is some lasting consequence of that first sin, and the lasting consequence is that we are born in this world. So while we are born pure, none of us are born outside of history. A baby is born and has needs to be fed, needs to be loved, needs to be sheltered. And some babies will find loving arms and warm shelter and nourishing food. And some babies will find hunger, will find abuse, will find neglect, will find harm. The child has done nothing to deserve that neglect, that harm, and that pain. But what is the response of being unjustly harmed and hurt and abandoned and neglected? It is necessarily that a child will begin to develop behaviors to survive in that situation, to adapt in that situation. Maybe we'll learn to steal. Maybe we'll learn to lie. Maybe we'll learn that using force, like the force that was done to him or her, will get them what they want. And so the darkness that exists in people very rarely is purely of an individual creation, the result of an individual will. And that is why all of us have what in Islamic ethics is called a collective obligation, fard kifaya, a collective obligation to ensure that every human being on this earth, as well as other creatures, have their rights respected and their basic needs met. If, as a collectivity, we do not meet these needs, if we neglect the children who are hungry, if we turn away at the animals that are beaten, if we refuse to visit the sick and the lonely, our whole community bears the burden of collective sin. So there is individual sin and there is collective sin. Now, can we ever meet our obligations perfectly? Probably not. But a sincere, serious attempt to do so is what's necessary and what's required of us. I fear that when I look at my community, the Muslim community, and see what kind of needs are prioritized in terms of our collective obligations, it is so focused on ourselves as a community who's trying to be defensive against criticisms, attacks, claims, very unjust claims about what we believe or who we are or what we do. So when I listen to sermons, when I listen to, I see the kind of organizations that we have that are rightfully standing up for those individual Muslims who are being harassed or marginalized or discriminated against. I support so much what they're doing, but that's not all that we have to do, because not all darkness is external. We are not in every case a victim. We are not in every case only the oppressed, but we also are oppressors. We also commit evil. We also are engaged in occasions of rationalizing our violence, stepping over the line. And we know that it's wrong. And perhaps that's why sometimes I look at my young activist friends and I see a lot of anger. I don't see sometimes very much satisfaction in seeking justice. They have a passion for justice, yet their souls are disquieted. And so we need to return to something that is a deep tradition that for generations all Muslims have followed and taught, but is so much neglected, and that is the purification of the heart. That is the collective examination of the state of our community in relation to other communities. We need to institutionalize that more, because otherwise it is possible for us to simply miss the mark. After 9/11, in a few days after 9/11, there was a man who went on a rampage in Texas, and he shot a bunch of people who he thought were Muslim. One of them happened to be a Sikh, and he killed that person. And one of the people who this man, who was very angry about 9/11, shot was a man originally from Bangladesh named Rais Bhutan, who was working he was at a gas station. He was shot, he almost died. His whole face was mutilated with the buckshot. He spent the next 2 years recovering and feeling very depressed and very sad. And then he decided that he had to do something. So he decided to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And at that pilgrimage, he focused purely on trying to become close to God, trying to purify his heart from what had happened, not liking the fact that his heart was filled with sadness and distress and anger. And so he worked on this purification. And when he came back, he decided that what he really had to do and what was required from him and what was the best example from the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad was forgiveness. And so he wrote to the man who was now on death row in Texas and told him that he forgave him. And then he went one step further. He went around to all of the families of the people who were killed and the survivors and said, will you support me in forgiving him? And will you support me in petitioning the governor to pardon this man so he won't be killed? And with a lot of heartfelt conversation, he was able to do that. And he went and he told this man, a white supremacist, that he had forgiven him and that he loved him and that he realized, he engaged in a conversation with him, and this man told him about the horrible life he had had, the abuse as a child, his whole lifetime that had brought him to this point of making him an angry person. And in the end, the governor refused to pardon him and insisted on his execution on death row. But the day before he died, he had another conversation with this Muslim man from Bangladesh who he had shot, and he said, it's the first time in my life when someone has ever showed me love, and someone has ever showed me that my life is worthwhile. And even though I go to my death tomorrow, I'm so grateful that you brought me back to this state of dignity. What an amazing example, you know. What an amazing example for all of us. And if we would all take that example, so much would change in our society. It's not that protests, it's not that legislation, it's not that activism aren't important, but what really changes people is examining our own heart and being loving and forgiving in the way that we want to be loved and forgiven. And for that, you know, I hope, because when I look and I see at the kind of violence that's happening in various parts of the world in the name of my religion, which I love, it's distressing, it's upsetting, it is often confusing. But when I read some of the research on the people who are engaging in this, and when I've talked to friends of individuals who have committed these acts of violence, and some young people who had friends who went on and committed these acts of terrorist violence, what they told me again and again is that this is a person who could not forgive himself for what he had done. People who had either had a difficult life or maybe had an easy life, and in having an easy life, they went and they took advantage of other people, and they harmed other people, and they harmed their own souls. And they didn't hear messages, or they weren't able to hear messages of transformation. What they had heard were messages of anger, and they took that and they externalized the anger that they felt and the darkness that they felt inside themselves, and they tried to extinguish it by looking at these external targets. And I'll end with another story. There's a story, again, told by the Prophet Muhammad, in which he said that there was a man who had killed 99 people, a vicious murderer. 99 people he had killed. And this man began to be, got to the point where he was so weighed down with the darkness in his soul for all of these horrible actions that he had done, that he decided, I want to just find out, is there any way that I could be forgiven for this? And some people said, well, why don't you go talk to this holy person and ask him? And he went and he said to the holy person, I've killed 99 people. Can you tell me, is there any hope for forgiveness? And this holy person said to him, no way. 99 people that you've killed? There's no way you could be forgiven. And so the murderer killed him. Now it was 100. But then he said, he had, and this is what faith is, this is going back to that original pure state and knowledge of God that we all have, this tiny inkling, maybe there is some forgiveness. And he asked around, and some people said, there's this very wise scholar in this place. Why don't you go and ask him? Maybe he can tell you if it's possible. And so the man set out on the road to seek the answer that he so desperately desired, that it was possible for him to regain, to lift himself from this burden of darkness and regain a state of peace with God. And on that road, he died. He never made it there. And at that point, the angels who come and take the soul of the human being came and said, they discovered that he was on the road to seeking this answer, and they argued with themselves. The angels argued among themselves whether they should take him to the mercy of God and ultimate forgiveness, or whether he should be taken to the hellfire. And the angels said, well, let's measure where he is in the road. And they found that he was right in the middle of the road. And so at that point, the Lord of creation extended the road in the direction of the land where he had come, and shortened the road in the direction of the place where he was going, and he was closer to his goal of ultimately seeking forgiveness and reconciliation. And so he was brought back into the mercy of God, back to the mercy of his Creator. So the holy man who preaches only that we are evil and that there is no hope, and that what we need to understand is that we are people without any possibility of redemption, are not the ones who we need to seek. We need to seek those who bring us hope, because we all have hearts that have at least some darkness in them, and we need to seek the path out of that darkness, and we need to seek that both individually and collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop McDonald and Dr. Vassman, for beginning our conversation this evening. We're now going to broaden the conversation a little by inviting Dr. Darrell Bryant, who's the director of the Center for Dialogue and Spirituality in World Religions, and Dr. Timothy Giannotti, associate professor in studies in Islam, to respond to our speakers. And while they're making their way to the stage, if you've written down questions for Bishop McDonald or Dr. Vassman, please hold them in the air and the ushers will collect them.
This is a somewhat difficult moment. And the first thing I want to say is simply thank you to both of our speakers. in the late 1960s, early 1970s, I worked for the Lutheran Federation. And I was asked to organize a program that would address the problem of hunger. And it was specifically focused on Latin America. And I spent that year traveling throughout Latin America and visiting virtually every country in the continent, trying to set up a week in an urban setting and a week in a rural setting. And then these young people that were to be a part of this program would come to the Fifth Assembly of the Lutheran World Federation, which was going to be held in Brazil. This was a very difficult time in Brazil. It was a time of the military dictatorship. And when I went to Latin America on that first visit, my first task was to visit this remarkable Catholic bishop, Dom Helder de Câmara, who was known as the Red Bishop of Brazil, because when he had become a bishop, he had refused to live in the bishop's palace, but instead had taken up residence in the back of the church in one of the poorest districts of Recife in northeast Brazil. So when I arrived at his church, I had just heard that in the week prior to my coming, the chaplain at the university had been taken hostage by a group of right-wing vigilantes, and they had tied him up and drug him through the streets of Recife and deposited his dead body on the steps of Don Helder's church. And I met this remarkable man who lived very, very humbly and very, very simply. In the back of the church with his bed at one end and a stove at the other end and a round table in the middle. And this was my first Catholic bishop to meet. And that experience during those years was my sort of introduction to this extremely difficult issue that both of our speakers addressed, of how difficult it is within our religious institutions, as well as within our human engagement, to engage in self-reflection, to see how the teachings of our tradition call our own actions into question. And we've heard two very eloquent statements that identify this need for self-reflection, for self-examination, for self-purification as a really central issue in trying to deal with our darkness. And I remember, too, my disappointment when we ended up meeting for that assembly. And as the contribution of the youth to that meeting, we decided that we would hand out to all the 500 delegates a little handful of rice as an example of what this vast portion of humanity is expected to survive on daily in the midst of our affluence. And I was somewhat disappointed in the response of the church to that event because they weren't so happy with our congregation. They felt that somehow we had taken something away from the meeting, like getting the church to turn in and look at itself and what it was sort of doing in the world. And tonight we heard two very eloquent responses to this question of dealing with our darkness. And I just want to close with one further comment. When you spoke about the medicine wheel and the four directions, it struck a very resonant chord with me because of a man by the name of Eugen Rosenstock Husey, who also has a fourfold approach to knowledge and life on what he calls the cross of reality. That our life is extended in time between the past and the future, and on space between the inner world and the outer world, and that we are all crucified daily on the cross of reality, so that our human situation is a kind of dealing with darkness and that other aspect of life, that eternal hope and possibility that lies before our humanity. So thank you very, very much for your comments and contributions this evening.
I feel very honored to be here tonight. I'm very honored to be in the presence of courageous souls who are willing to be vulnerable in one another's presence. We have all attended interfaith gatherings that just become a celebration of the light, all that is good about us. And then we eat some falafel, we take our pictures with the rabbi or with the priest, and everything is good. We're good, you're good, right? Islam, I've heard it so many times, Islam is just like Christianity. And so we compare it to Windows. So we've got Windows 2.0 over here, and we've got Windows 3.5. It's all the same, right? And so the idea of subtly and politely imposing our own supremacies and our own fantasies of perfection or superiority upon one another is such a non-transformative and ridiculous practice. And so over the years, I've really come to believe that the only interfaith engagement and dialogue that is really transformative, that really changes us, is when we're willing to be vulnerable in one another's presence. When we're willing to really to be real and to be humble. Something the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, said that when we were together in Doha some years ago. He said that for him, the building bridges, the interfaith dialogue was not so much about looking upon one another, but it was gazing upon one another when the other was gazing toward God. And so we ask ourselves, what do we mean by darkness? It's interesting that the Quran always presents darkness in the plural. When the Quran is speaking about revelation, it speaks about this process by which God lifts people out of the darknesses of dhulumat and brings them into the light, which is always singular. And so as I think about this nature of what is darkness, we think about all of those things which lead us into places of fragmentation and plurality. Division, supremacy, alienation from the creation, alienation from one another, the placing of one group above another, the exteriorizing, as Ingrid said so beautifully, the exteriorizing of darkness and the denial of darkness within. My oldest son is here, and he will be very angry at me for calling attention to this, but there was a moment, there have been many moments when he has taught me profound lessons, and this is a moment that we've never really talked about. He was a young boy, and we were walking in the countryside in Oregon, and we heard some church bells, and we remarked about the church bells, and we started talking about God. And then he said, so God is everywhere, right? And I said, yeah, God is everywhere. And he said, well, that means God's in hell too, right? And I said, yeah, I guess God is in hell too. And if you're in hell and you're aware that God is in hell too, then maybe hell stops being hell at that point. And I think that this is a lesson for us about darknesses. The Sufi tradition of Islam, the spiritual traditions of Islam, talk about the darknesses, the cracks, the holes within us. Those are the places where the divine light comes in. And so this language of the journey, we had stories about journey, teaching stories about the journey to God, the path to God from Ingrid. And Bishop Mark also said so profoundly, the road to reparations. And I really think in listening to the presentations tonight and in thinking very seriously about where we need to go, I think that the road to reparations is the road to God. But there's no way to go to God without facing these veils, these barriers, these darknesses. Because if we deny the darknesses within us, it seems that we're denying the possibility for God to reveal God's self within us and within our broken places, within our cracked places. And so we talk about the hard heart in English. We use that language of the hard heart. The hard heart has no cracks. It has no holes. It has no darkness. And I think that part of the mystery of pondering the importance of darkness in our interfaith engagement is honoring this incredible phenomenon which exists within all religious practice, this incredible phenomenon of God turning those dark places into light. In the same way that the divine presence in hell removes the fire and replaces it with light. Because if we do not acknowledge these holes, these dark places, we're really denying the reality of God being God. And then our religious systems become anthropocentric, human-centered in the worst possible way. Because we remove transcendence. And I think in all of these dark places, one of the things that we learn is a story that surfaces so beautifully in the story of Joseph. And here I'm referring now to the biblical telling of that story, not the Quranic telling, even though both tellings teach the same lesson. And that is, as it says explicitly in the Hebrew Bible, that they intended evil by this, but God intended good. And this mystery of good coming out of evil, or light coming out of darkness, is, I think, the fundamental mystery of the faithful life. And so the journey of faith is a journey of allowing God to enter those darknesses. But before we can allow the divine light to enter those darknesses, we have to acknowledge that they exist and where they exist. And then our religion becomes less about us and more about God's transcendent, supreme power to illumine these places and to make of them something beautiful, something life-giving, something unity and not fragmented, something healing and not something alienating. And so I'm very privileged and very honored to be in a room where we can respectfully, reverently, prayerfully ponder the great mysteries of light and darkness. And to ponder, even as religion is implicated in these acts of inhumanity and these acts of oppression and violation and soul-stealing violence, so too religion has that capacity, that restorative capacity, to allow something transcendent and divine to enter into those very moments, those very places, and produce something beautiful, something life-giving. But this is not a beauty of our making. This is a beauty of divine